Chapter 389. People can live like this? Things here are so expensive. That was Bai Xiaochun a year ago, when he first arrived in Sky City. Hey, this looks pretty nice. It's a bit expensive but, whatever, I'll just grin and bear it. That was Bai Xiaochun during his days profiting from the ultra-fasting 8 pills. This looks great, I'll take it. That was Bai Xiaochun when the Azure Dragon Society was beginning to rise to prominence in the North District. And now, currently, Bai Xiaochun was in the Magic Pavilion, looking at about 100 magical items on display. Sounding very pleased with himself, he began to point at some of the objects. This one, that one, oh, that one too. Those are the 3 I don't want. I'll take everything else. The shop attendants were sweating, and their hearts pounding at having such a rich and important person to deal with. Bai Xiaochun really couldn't help but live so extravagantly. Whether it was in terms of food, clothing, or anything else, he only got the best. If you added up the value of everything he was currently wearing, it would be valued at something around 7-800,000 merit points. In fact, if he wanted to be promoted to the Rainbow District, it would be a very simple thing. But Bai Xiaochun couldn't bear to leave Sky City, and was convinced that life on the Rainbow definitely wouldn't be as nice. In fact, he had even made some inquiries, and had been informed that his suspicions were correct. Nobody on the Rainbow lived like he did now. Therefore, he had made up his mind to spend the rest of his time as a hostage in Sky City. Only an idiot would go to that rainbow, he thought, humming a little tune as he swaggered through the crowd. When people in the North District caught sight of him, expressions of both envy and respect could be seen in their eyes. He was beside himself with delight, and couldn't stop thinking about how outstanding he was. Everywhere he went, he ended up being the center of attention. The truth was, he didn't really care much about the money, and didn't even pay much attention to how much the Azure Dragon Society was saving up. As long as there were enough merit points to keep the Azure Dragon Society running, he didn't care. However, there were a few aspects to his wonderful life that he wasn't too pleased about. Because the Azure Dragon Society had expanded so quickly, their new recruits were a mix of good and bad. Other organizations within Sky City had sent people to infiltrate them, and that was especially true of the Celestial Sky Society. Furthermore, as the Azure Dragon Society expanded into the other 3 districts, rumors began to spread. Some rumors claimed that Bai Xiaochun was none other than the apothecary Bai from the East District. Others focused on how wicked and violent the Azure Dragon Society was. The third type of common rumor focused on how harmful and addictive the fantasy pills supposedly were. In the end, virtually all of the rumors were about the Azure Dragon Society and Bai Xiaochun, like a wide net slowly being stretched out over the both of them. Master God Diviner quickly caught on to this. Other than the first small group of cultivators who had made up the original Azure Dragon Society, few people ever saw him. He was Bai Xiaochun's trusted advisor who lurked in the shadows, unseen by the public. When Bai Xiaochun got Master God Diviner's report about the rumors, he took it very seriously. He was well aware of the devious ways of the Celestial Sky Society, and could well imagine that their lack of action during the past few months was because they were waiting for the right moment to deliver a fatal blow. Considering how seriously Bai Xiaochun took the matter, Master God Diviner did so as well. He quickly mobilized all of the Azure Dragon Society to try to counteract the rumors. Unfortunately, their work did little to quell the gossip, and in fact, it grew even worse. One evening, Bai Xiaochun was enjoying his evening meal, an exotic spread of the finest delicacies piled up as high as mountains, with 2 lovely female cultivators there to serve him. Master God Diviner also sat at the table, providing his usual daily report regarding the affairs of the Azure Dragon Society. That was when the news came in. Boss, the investigations we started running a few days ago identified one of the main sources of the rumors. We captured him and brought him in, and now we just need you to come decide what to do, boss. Bai Xiaochun grunted an acknowledgement as he continued to munch on the chicken leg he had just picked up. Master God Diviner smacked his hand down onto the table and gave a cold harumph. Bring him here, let's see who it is that had the gall to stir up trouble for us. Before long, shrill shrieks of terror could be heard, drawing closer and closer to the room where Bai Xiaochun and Master God Diviner were eating dinner. Fellow Taoists of the Azure Dragon Society, spare me. I'm sorry, really, I'm truly sorry. The shrieking grew louder and louder as 2 burly Azure Dragon Society cultivators dragged the young man with disheveled hair into the room. The young man didn't struggle at all as the 2 burly cultivators forced him onto his knees. Not daring to look up, he continued to whimper and cry for mercy. Spare me, Boss Azure Dragon. I'm sorry, sir, really, I won't ever dare to do it again. I was a fool to work for the Celestial Sky Society. Please, forgive me, Boss Azure Dragon. The young man's wails were truly inspiring of pity. However, as the young man prattled on, Bai Xiaochun stopped gnawing on the chicken leg and looked closer at him. Next to him, Master God Diviner's eyes widened. Then, the 2 of them exchanged a glance. Both of them had simultaneously realized that, unexpectedly, the young cultivator begging for mercy was Su Bokai. He had been beaten up, his nose swollen and his hair completely disheveled. His voice was hoarse, and he still hadn't even dared to lift his head. A strained expression appeared on Bai Xiaochun's face. Clearing his throat, he finished the chicken leg and then suddenly yelled, Zhu Bokai. Zhu Bokai had been kneeling there with his head bowed. In response to Bai Xiaochun's sudden outburst, he screamed and prepared to continue begging for mercy. However, the voice from just now seemed very familiar, and without even thinking about it, he looked up, to find an unfamiliar face behind the mounds of exquisite delicacies on the table. The other face at the table was not unfamiliar, though. Shocked, he realized that the second person sitting there was Master God Diviner. Zhu Bokai's jaw dropped, and a blank expression filled his eyes. In that moment, the unfamiliar face suddenly blurred, and then, he was looking at a face that was anything but unfamiliar. Zhu Bokai's mind was spinning, and a look of complete and utter incredulity could be seen on his face. Bai, he shrieked. However, before he could finish his sentence, a chicken leg shot through the air and entered his mouth. Coughing dryly, Bai Xiaochun smiled and said, How did you get yourself in such a bad situation, Zhu Bokai? I mean, I thought I had it bad, but obviously, you have it way worse than me. After seeing Bai Xiaochun's reaction, the two men holding Zhu Bokai released him. Aware that some things weren't meant for their ears, they quickly departed. Zhu Bokai's eyes were completely bloodshot from crying. As he looked at Bai Xiaochun with his glittering magical treasures, his face glowing with health, his table full of spirit food, Zhu Bokai began to punt. The combined value of all of that wasn't quite enough to rise to the yellow-robed disciple level, but it was very close. In sharp contrast, the income he made from selling information couldn't reach that level in a 60-year cycle. Furthermore, the fact that Bai Xiaochun was now boss Azure Dragon was completely mind-blowing, to the point where tears began to leak out of his eyes. In addition to all that, the two women waiting upon Bai Xiaochun weren't actual people, they were ingeniously crafted puppets. Zhu Bokai trembled at that. Such lifelike puppets were astronomically expensive. Zhu Bokai also couldn't help but notice all of the glittering magical treasures that Master God Diviner was wearing, and how his cultivation-based fluctuations were clearly at a higher level than the last time they had met. Much to Zhu Bokai's bitterness, Master God Diviner was obviously getting very close to core formation. By now, he was filled with deep and utter regret regarding his earlier decision to leave the group. As he thought back to the rough and bitter days he had experienced trying to gather and sell information, he almost couldn't believe he had been so arrogant. Furthermore, how could he have missed the fact that Bai Xiaochun had become the boss of the Azure Dragon Society? The mere thought of how leaving Bai Xiaochun had caused him to lose out on this incredible opportunity left him extremely bitter. Junior Patriarch, I really messed up, he said, staring up piteously at Bai Xiaochun. As of this moment, he had decided in his heart that he would stick with Bai Xiaochun no matter what, even if he tried to drive him away. Ah, whatever, Bai Xiaochun said, waving his hand in grandly dismissive fashion. I brought you here with me, didn't I? Therefore, I'm responsible for you. You might have mercilessly dumped me early on, but I'm a magnanimous person. From now on, you stick with me, alright? Tears of gratitude immediately began to pour down Zhu Bokai's face. As for Master God Diviner, he cleared his throat awkwardly. After all, the words Bai Xiaochun had just uttered sound quite familiar to him. It's getting late, Bai Xiaochun said, so why don't you go rest up? Tomorrow we can reminisce a bit about old times. Having finished eating, Bai Xiaochun waved his hand, and one of the serving girls came over to wipe his mouth with a handkerchief. Sighing, he stuck his chin up and looked at the girl, then said, Let's go. Carry me over to my pill concocting station. The two serving girls picked Bai Xiaochun up and floated away. He didn't even need to walk at this point. Master God Diviner quickly rose to his feet, clasped hands, and bowed. Then, in a voice which sounded well rehearsed, said, Farewell, my lord. This display left Zhu Bokai shocked into stupefaction. How could he ever have imagined that life could be lived in such a way? Chapter 390, Kidnapped Bai Xiaochun. I want to live like this too. Zhu Bokai wailed inwardly as he watched Bai Xiaochun leave. A moment later, Master God Diviner rose from his bow, cleared his throat, and said, Brother Zhu, it's been a few months. How did you end up in such a bad situation? Zhu Bokai's wrath was immediately aroused. After all, it had been the goading of Master God Diviner that had convinced him to leave Bai Xiaochun to begin with. However, he knew that now was not the time to give voice to his anger. All he could do was put a bitter expression on his face and curse Master God Diviner inwardly. Master God Diviner actually felt a bit bad. Sighing, he said, Don't blame me for all this. Even I had no idea that our junior patriarch would rise to such shocking heights. In Sky City, not everything depends on cultivation base, you know. With that, Master God Diviner arranged for a place for Zhu Bokai to stay, and even gave him some merit points as pocket money. As Master God Diviner led Zhu Bokai to his new accommodations, Zhu Bokai came to realize that Master God Diviner also occupied a lofty position within the Azure Dragon Society. All the cultivators in the Immortals cave who saw him gazed upon him with expressions of deep respect. Zhu Bokai was starting to get more and more excited. That night, he found it hard to sleep. The next morning at dawn, he walked bleary-eyed out of his room, uttering another oath under his breath. I have to become more important to the junior patriarch than Master God Diviner is. With Zhu Bokai back, Bai Xiaochun now had one more of his original group of Dao protectors. Zhu Bokai immediately began to go above and beyond the call of duty when it came to his work, gathering information and propagating rumors. Under his direction, the Azure Dragon Society wasn't just able to quell some of the bad rumors being spread about them, they were actually able to fight back with increasing effectiveness. Zhu Bokai was going all out, using every trick in his book to achieve the best results possible. Bai Xiaochun had plenty of spare time on his hands. Master God Diviner took care of day-to-day operations, Zhu Bokai was responsible for handling intelligence, and they had a few dozen orange-robed disciples to act as sub-bosses. The Azure Dragon Society was growing more and more stable. Their expansion hadn't slowed in the least, and in fact, they were still growing. As a result, their fantasy pill business grew with shocking speed. The Celestial Sky Society had been doing plenty of plotting and scheming, but it did little good. They were very capable of handling problems with individuals, but when it came to other large organizations in the city, they fell short. The rise of the Azure Dragon Society had come too quickly and unexpectedly, and because of that, the Celestial Sky Society was completely incapable of dealing with them. The matter with the rumors had been one part of their initial plan, and although it had started out well, in the end, it fell flat. As their other strategies failed, the Celestial Sky Society grew increasingly enraged by the Azure Dragon Society. One reason was that everything they did had to be accomplished from the shadows. Eventually, their research into the fantasy pill revealed that the boss of the Azure Dragon Society was none other than the very same apothecary Bai who had created the ultra-fasting 8 pill. Unfortunately, when they tried to investigate Bai Xiaochun's past, they came up with nothing. Not even their agents in the Azure Dragon Society itself could come up with any information. Apparently, very few people within the Azure Dragon Society even knew the level of his cultivation base. Thanks to the training provided by Master God Diviner, the original members who did know a bit about Bai Xiaochun were circumspect and kept their information to themselves. Although the Celestial Sky Society was a bit apprehensive that Bai Xiaochun seemed to have come out of nowhere, it wasn't completely unheard of for people in the Starry Sky Dao polarity sect to be so secretive. As far as looking into the origins of the fantasy pill, it might have seemed like a good idea, but the truth was that they had come across the pill completely by accident, and had no idea where it came from. Besides, the Eastern cultivation world was a huge place, and the things that went on in the lower reaches were of little interest to people upriver. As the days marched by, the Celestial Sky Society watched the Azure Dragon Society growing larger and larger. Eventually, the Azure Dragon Society's fantasy pill sales surpassed the Celestial Sky Society's, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. The Celestial Sky Society's headquarters was in the central district of Sky City, and currently, a meeting was going on there to try to decide what to do about the Azure Dragon Society. Some were in favor of continued plotting and scheming, with the eventual goal of breaking the Azure Dragon Society apart. However, a plan like that would take some time to be effective. At one point in the meeting, a cold snort echoed out. "We can't wait any longer. It's not that our Celestial Sky Society can't use force to solve the problem, it's that we can't afford to break any rules. These people from the Azure Dragon Society are just too stubborn. Look, what's the point of having endless meetings about this? Have you people forgotten how powerful the Celestial Sky Society is? Let's just go kidnap that apothecary Bai." "But we don't know the level of his cultivation base," someone protested. "Without that bit of knowledge, trying to do something like that. There are plenty of things under heaven that we don't know. Is that a good reason to just back down? No matter how impressive his background, can he match up to the Celestial Sky Society? We come from a Deva clan. As for his cultivation base, there's no way he's a nascent soul expert. It's even highly unlikely that he's at core formation. If he were, why wouldn't he have been promoted to the Rainbow District? Why would he waste his time here concocting medicine?" The person making these arguments had a relatively high position in the organization, and as such, no one was willing to go against him. Although most of them weren't quite convinced that it was a good idea, they merely exchanged glances and then held their tongues. Soon, the Celestial Sky Society was stirring. They didn't have any core formation cultivators, only people in the great circle of the foundation establishment stage, and a few quasi-core stage experts. After all, there were only red and orange-robed disciples in their organization. Those who had reached the yellow-robed level had already left, and couldn't easily be called back. In order to handle Bai Xiaochun, they gathered 10 quasi-core cultivators, as well as a few dozen in the great circle of foundation establishment, plus even more who were in late foundation establishment. After night fell, they headed straight into the North District, toward the Immortals cave that was the headquarters of the Azure Dragon Society. A group that powerful was strong enough to dominate any other organization in the entire city. They didn't hold anything back in terms of speed. After all, this was a surprise attack, and the success of their plan hinged on clinching victory in the first move. Although the main plan was to kidnap him, if worse came to worst, they were also prepared to kill him, and deal with the consequences later. It was a dark and windy night, and Bai Xiaochun was just preparing to settle down cross-legged to start cultivating his frigid school will evolving incantation. After all of his recent cultivation, he was nearing the peak of the frigid acolyte level. The frigid chi which swirled around him would be shocking to anyone who could see it, and caused layers of frost to slowly cake the walls of the room. Thankfully, his cultivation was mostly focused inwardly, because such intensely frigid chi could freeze even foundation establishment cultivators to death. He had just settled his chi and cleared his mind when, all of a sudden, his eyes widened. Looking up, a strange expression appeared on his face. But then, he merely cleared his throat, and then closed his eyes to meditate. Meanwhile, numerous shadowy figures were approaching the Immortals' cave. After exchanging glances, they charged forward, which caused the Azure Dragon Society's defensive spell formation to spring up. Immediately following that, thunderous booms filled the air as the Celestial Sky Society cultivators unleashed all of their most powerful attacks, blasting the spell formation shield to pieces. The Azure Dragon Society responded immediately, the cultivators inside shouting at the tops of their lungs and unleashing magical techniques in all directions. Beat it. But then the 10 Quasi-Core cultivators waded into the fight, and no matter how well prepared the Azure Dragon Society cultivators were, they couldn't deal with such power. They were immediately put on the defensive. By this point, the sub-bosses of the Azure Dragon Society realized what kind of people they were fighting. Quasi-Core stage. Gasps rang out as the 10 Quasi-Core cultivators stomped everything in their path as easily as dried weeds. In almost the exact same instant, the spice that had infiltrated the Azure Dragon Society appeared. Boss Azure Dragon's room is right there. Arrogant expressions could be seen on the faces of the 10 Quasi-Core cultivators as they shot toward Bai Xiaochun's room. 6 of them were faster than the others, and it was with complete disdain that they crashed into his room. As for the other 4, they remained outside to prevent anyone from entering. After tonight, the Azure Dragon Society won't have any boss at all, one of the Quasi-Core cultivators said loftily. The Azure Dragon Society cultivators were getting very nervous, and the cultivators from the Celestial Sky Society were chuckling coldly, convinced that their mission had been accomplished, and that once a boom rang out from that room, they could flee. However, instead of a boom, their ears were met with silence. After the 6 Quasi-Core cultivators charged into his room, no sounds of combat emerged. It was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Expressions of shock began to appear on the faces of everyone in the crowd, with the exception of Master God Diviner and Zubokai, who were looking on with disdain. What happened? Someone whispered. Something definitely seemed off about the situation. The door to the room looked like a black mouth ready to swallow up anyone who entered it. Many people present felt chills running down their spine just at the sight of it. The 4 Quasi-Core cultivators exchanged glances, and then gritted their teeth to take action. They couldn't just leave now and return with no information to report. Joining their power together, they moved to enter the room. However, before they could reach the door, a blast of frigid chi erupted from the room, filling the area. As the frigid chi filled them, it felt like they were being frozen in place, causing their eyes to go wide with disbelief. One of the Quasi-Core cultivators suddenly began to emit red light as he burned a paper talisman in defense. With the power of the flames assisting him, he managed to stagger backward a few paces, his face ashen. Eyes wide with shock and terror, he cried, "Core formation."